The elderly woman stood before 200 faces in the Holocaust Memorial Museum, Washington, D.C., October 1985. Her hands trembled slightly as she raised them for the audience to see. 60 years old now, silver hair pulled back, fingers slightly crooked at the knuckles, scars visible even from the back row. These hands stopped moving on November 28, 1944. I was certain they would never move again. The room fell silent. Someone coughed. A camera shutter clicked. But they did move again, because of a decision made by two American soldiers I had been taught to fear. She lowered her hands slowly. Behind her, projected on a screen 20 feet tall, a black and white photograph showed 15 women in tattered German uniforms standing in snow. Their faces were hollow. Their eyes were enormous. They looked like ghosts. To understand why I am here today, you must understand what happened that winter. You must go back with me to the coldest day I have ever known. Not the coldest in temperature, though it was cold enough, but the coldest in certainty. The day I learned that everything I believed was a lie. The lights dimmed. Another photograph appeared. A map of the German-French border. A small town circled in red. Saarbrücken, November 1944. The Western Front collapsing inward like a dying star. By the time autumn gave way to winter, everyone knew. The Reich was losing, not slowly, not gradually, catastrophically. American forces had pushed across France and Belgium after the Normandy landings in June. By September, they were at Germany's western border. By November, they were through it. Entire German units were retreating or surrendering or simply dissolving into the case of roads clogged with refugees and wreckage. Supply lines were broken. Communications had failed. Radio operators sent messages into silence and received only static in return. Scattered across this shrinking battlefield were thousands of German auxiliaries. Not soldiers in the traditional sense, clerks and radio operators and nurses and anti-aircraft assistants. Young women attached to Luftwaffe units or Reich Labor Service battalions. Many of them had never fired a weapon. Most had never expected to see combat. Helena Fischer was 19 years old, born in Dresden in 1925. Classical piano student at the conservatory before the war made such things seem frivolous. She had been conscripted into the Luftwaffe Signals Corps in early 1944, Nachrichtenhelferin, communications helper. Her job was to receive radio transmissions and decode them according to cipher books she was never allowed to take home. She was good at it, precise, methodical. The kind of mind that could hold complex patterns and recognize when something was wrong. The kind of hands that could operate telegraph keys for hours without cramping. Pianist hands, long fingers, delicate joints, strong from years of practice but elegant. Beautiful hands. Her fiancé Werner had said so in every letter he sent from the Eastern Front. Helena carried those letters in a canvas bag slung across her shoulder. 12 letters. The most recent dated July 10, 1943, over 16 months old. She told herself he was simply too busy to write. That mail from the front was irregular, that he was alive somewhere thinking of her planning their future. She knew better. Deep down she knew. But hope is a stubborn thing. It survives even when reason dies. On November 26, 1944, Helena's signals unit received orders to evacuate eastward ahead of advancing American forces. They were stationed near Saarbrücken, a border town that had changed hands 3 times already. The front was fluid now, unpredictable. Maps were obsolete the moment they were printed. The evacuation was supposed to be organized. Trucks would arrive. The women would load equipment and personal belongings. They would drive east to a secondary position behind the lines and continue operations from there. The trucks never came. Instead, chaos. Officers shouting contradictory orders. Soldiers streaming past in retreat, many without weapons or helmets. Wounded men lying in doorways calling for medics who were already gone. Civilians pushing carts loaded with everything they owned. The roads were impassable. The sky was gray. Snow was beginning to fall. Helena's unit commander, a Luftwaffe lieutenant named Schneider, made a decision. They would move on foot. 15 women. They would take only what they could carry. They would avoid main roads and move through secondary routes toward the east. Once they reached friendly lines, they would report to the nearest Wehrmacht command post and await further orders. 15 women. Helena could name them all, even now, 41 years later. Could see their faces as clearly as if they stood before her. Anna Richter, 24 years old, from Hamburg. Dark hair pulled back severely, practical, skeptical. A clerk who had worked for an anti-aircraft battery keeping records of ammunition expenditure and target acquisition rates. Her father had been executed by the Gestapo in 1934 for communist organizing. Anna trusted no authority. Sophie Klein, 18 years old, from a farm in Bavaria. Reich Labor Service conscript. She had been digging ditches and hauling supplies for 6 months. Rosy-cheeked despite the hunger. Strong despite the exhaustion. Terrified despite trying to hide it. She carried rosary beads her mother had given her and whispered prayers constantly under her breath. And 12 others whose names Helena would recite like a liturgy for the rest of her life. They walked for 18 hours, through fields and along tree lines, avoiding roads where American patrols moved in jeeps and trucks, avoiding towns where combat might still be happening. The temperature dropped as night fell. Their breath became visible. Their fingers went numb inside thin gloves. They had rations for 2 days. They had no winter coats. They had identification papers and a letter from Lieutenant Schneider authorizing their movement. They had no weapons except a single pistol Schneider carried with 6 rounds in the cylinder. On the afternoon of November 27, 1944, at 3:47 in the afternoon, according to Helena's watch, they walked around a bend in a forest path and found themselves face to face with an American patrol. 4 soldiers, 90th Infantry Division, rifles raised, eyes alert, young men who looked as tired as Helena felt. Hands up. Drop your bags. Nobody move. The words were in English, but the meaning was universal. Helena raised her hands. So did the others. They stood in a line, 15 women in German uniforms, hands in the air, waiting to discover what happened next. Helena had been told what to expect. The propaganda had been very clear, very specific, very detailed. American soldiers were savages. They would defile women. They would torture prisoners. They would show no mercy because Americans were incapable of mercy. They were subhuman creatures motivated only by cruelty and base desires. Capture meant a fate worse than death. Death before dishonor. That was the phrase repeated in training. Better to die than to surrender. Better to end your own life than to face what the enemy would do. Helena's hand moved instinctively to the silver locket tucked inside her coat. Werner's photograph was inside. His face, his smile, the image she carried everywhere. If this was the end, she wanted his face to be the last thing she saw. But the Americans did not shoot. They did not charge forward with knives or bayonets. They did not drag anyone away. They looked bored. One of them, an older soldier with corporal stripes, said something into a radio handset. Another approached with his rifle lowered and began searching bags. He pulled out identification papers, glanced at them, set them aside. Pulled out a diary, flipped through it without reading, put it back. Found a photograph and studied it for a moment before returning it carefully. No violence, no threats, no leering or grabbing or any of the things Helena had been taught to expect. Just procedure. Just tired men doing a job they had done many times before. The corporal spoke to them in slow, careful German with a heavy accent. You are prisoners of war. You will be processed according to the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed if you cooperate. Do you understand? Helena understood, but she could not make the words make sense. Prisoners of war, Geneva Convention, will not be harmed. These were the monsters. These were the savages. These were the creatures who were supposed to be incapable of mercy, but they looked like boys, tired boys far from home who just wanted this war to be over. The walk to the American Processing Center took 2 hours. They were escorted by the 4 soldiers from the patrol, plus 2 more who joined them along the way. 6 guards for 15 unarmed women. Overkill. But the Americans were careful, methodical. They took no chances. The processing center was an improvised facility in Forbach, France, just across the border from Germany. An agricultural complex that had been requisitioned by the U.S. Army. A cluster of barns and sheds surrounded by hastily strung barbed wire. Guard towers at the corners. American flags snapping in the wind. It was not a formal prison camp. It was a temporary holding area. a place where prisoners could be registered and sorted before being transferred to permanent facilities farther from the front lines. The sign outside said Prisoner Reception Station 7. It looked like a farm. They arrived after dark, 8 o'clock in the evening. The temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below freezing, cold enough to make breath visible and fingers ache. Helena and the others were taken to a registration desk set up under an awning. A military police sergeant sat behind a folding table with a typewriter and a stack of index cards. He asked questions in German, translated by a French civilian who worked as an interpreter. Name, age, rank, unit, home address, next of kin. Helena answered mechanically. Fischer, Helena, 19, Nachrichtenhelferin, Luftwaffe Signals Battalion 12, Dresden, parents deceased. The sergeant typed each answer onto an index card. He did not look angry or cruel. He looked bored. He had processed hundreds of prisoners already today. Helena was just another card in the stack. Personal belongings. Empty your pockets. Helena placed the contents of her coat pockets onto the table. The silver locket, a handkerchief, 3 pfennig coins, a pencil stub, the bag of Werner's letters. The sergeant examined the locket, opened it, saw Werner's photograph inside, closed it gently and wrote on a separate form. 1 silver locket with photograph. Personal item. To be returned upon release. He did not mock it. He did not take it as a souvenir. He logged it carefully and placed it in an envelope with Helena's name written on the outside in neat handwriting. The letters were handled the same way. Counted, recorded, placed in the envelope. Helena watched them disappear and felt a piece of herself go with them. Werner's words, the only proof he had existed, the only connection to the life she used to have. After registration, the women were directed to a barn at the edge of the compound. It had been used for storing hay before the Americans arrived. Now it served as temporary housing for female prisoners until more permanent arrangements could be made. The barn was roughly 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. The walls were wood with gaps between the boards where wind could enter. The roof was intact but uninsulated. The floor was dirt covered with old straw that smelled of mildew and rot. There were no beds, no blankets, no heat. Wait here. Someone will bring supplies. The door closed. They were alone. 15 women stood in the darkness, too tired to speak, too cold to sit. The wind whistled through the gaps in the walls. Snow had begun to fall outside. They could see it through the cracks, white flakes drifting past in the dim light from the guard towers. Anna Richter was the first to move. She walked the perimeter of the barn, examining the walls and floor with a practical eye, testing the doors, looking for weak points, assessing their situation with the cold logic of someone who trusted nothing and no one. The doors are locked from outside. The walls have gaps, but nothing large enough to crawl through. There is one window too small to escape from. We are trapped. Sophie Klein sank to the ground, her back against the wall, and pulled out her rosary beads. She began to pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Her voice was barely audible. Helena stood in the center of the barn, paralyzed by confusion. Everything she had been taught said this should be worse. She should be afraid for her life. She should be planning escape or suicide or both. Instead, she felt nothing but exhaustion. Bone-deep weariness that made thought difficult and movement painful. An hour later, an American soldier opened the door. He carried an armload of thin wool blankets, the kind issued to U.S. troops. He dropped them inside the door without entering. 15 blankets, 1 for each prisoner. He said nothing. He left. The women stared at the blankets. Anna picked one up, examined it suspiciously, sniffed it as if checking for poison. It was a blanket, thin, well used, but clean and dry. They are giving us blankets. Her voice carried equal parts suspicion and disbelief. Sophie took one and wrapped it around her shoulders. Immediately her shivering lessened. It was not much, but it was something. Helena took hers last. She spread it on the straw and sat down, pulling the fabric tight around her body. The others arranged themselves in a rough circle, seeking shared warmth in the darkness. Do not trust this, Anna said. This is psychological warfare. They make us comfortable, so we lower our guard. Then they will interrogate us, torture us, make us give up information. What information? Helena asked. We operated radio equipment. We decoded messages we never understood. What could they possibly want from us? Anna had no answer. The hours crawled past. 10 o'clock, 11, midnight. The temperature continued to drop. 25 degrees, 22, 20. Helena tried to sleep but could not. The cold was pervasive. It crept through the blanket and through her coat and through every layer until it seemed to be inside her bones. Her feet were numb, her hands were numb, her face felt frozen. She reached into her coat pocket for the locket, forgetting for a moment that it was gone. Her hand found only empty fabric. Werner's face was in an envelope somewhere logged on a form reduced to an inventory item. The thought made her want to weep, but she was too cold even for tears. Beside her, Sophie prayed continuously. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. The words became a rhythm, a heartbeat in the darkness. Anna sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing, her face unreadable. Others huddled together, 2 or 3, sharing blankets, creating small islands of warmth in the frozen barn. Helena thought about Werner, tried to remember his voice, tried to imagine what he would tell her to do. Would he want her to fight, to escape, to maintain pride and honor, even unto death? Or would he want her to survive, to accept help from enemies if it meant staying alive, to let go of ideology and embrace pragmatism? She did not know. The Werner in her memory was the Werner of 1942 before the war changed him, before the Eastern Front ground away whatever softness he might have had. She had no idea what the Werner of 1943 would have said. She would never know. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Helena realized she could not feel her hands. At first, she thought it was simply numbness from the cold, the kind of sensation loss that happens when fingers get too cold and need to be warmed. She flexed them, trying to restore circulation. Nothing happened. She tried again. Concentrated on moving her fingers, willed them to bend. Still nothing. She brought her hands close to her face, trying to see them in the darkness. They looked pale, waxy. The color was wrong. She touched one hand with the other and could barely feel the contact. Panic rose in her chest. A pianist's hands. Her hands. The things that defined her. The tools of her craft. The connection between her mind and the music she created. If she lost her hands, she lost herself. She tried once more to make a fist. Her fingers would not obey. They hung limp and unresponsive. Around her, others were waking. Sitting up, making small sounds of distress, Sophie's voice came from the darkness. Helena, I cannot button my coat. Helena tried to respond, but found she could not speak clearly. Her lips were numb, her tongue felt thick. She looked at her hands again, tried one more time to move them. Nothing. They were dead, useless, frozen. The fear crystallized into something sharp and immediate. This was not going to pass. This was not simple numbness that would resolve with warmth. This was something worse, something permanent. She thought of the conservatory, the practice rooms with their perfect acoustics, the Steinway grand pianos kept in tune to a precision that bordered on obsessive, the feeling of keys beneath her fingers, the resistance and release, the way sound emerged from physical motion. All of that required hands that worked, fingers that obeyed, joints that bent. If her hands did not move, she was not a pianist. She was just a girl who used to play. Dawn came slowly. Gray light filtered through the gaps in the walls. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had not risen. If anything, it felt colder. Helena looked around the barn. 15 women in various states of distress, some still trying to sleep, others sitting up, rubbing their hands together, blowing on their fingers, trying desperately to generate warmth. Sophie was crying, not loudly, just quiet tears running down her cheeks as she stared at her hands. Her fingers were pale and stiff. She held them up like they belonged to someone else. Anna was awake, her face drawn and hard. She flexed her hands carefully, winced, but her fingers moved. Slowly and painfully, but they moved. Helena tried again. Nothing. The disconnect between her brain and her hands was complete. She could see them. She knew they were hers, but she could not make them work. Around her, she counted. 8 women with fingers that would not move. 5 more with severe stiffness. Only 2 seemed relatively unaffected. This was a crisis, not the kind that could be ignored or endured, the kind that required immediate intervention. Helena knew what the propaganda said. Do not show weakness to the enemy. Do not ask for help. Maintain pride and dignity even in suffering. Better to die than to beg. But Helena was a pianist, and pianists understood something fundamental about hands. They were not expendable. They were not negotiable. Without them, everything else was irrelevant. She made a decision. She stood though her legs barely supported her. She walked to the barn door, though every step required concentration. She raised one numb hand and pounded on the wood with the flat of her palm, since her knuckles would not bend. The sound echoed in the cold morning air. Once, twice, 3 times. Behind her, Anna hissed, "What are you doing?" "Stop!" Helena ignored her. She pounded again and again. A voice from outside. American, irritated. What Helena tried to speak, her mouth would not cooperate. She tried again, forced the words out in broken English learned from school lessons years ago. Help. Please. Problem. Silence from outside, then footsteps. The sound of a lock being turned. The door opened. An American soldier stood there. Young, maybe 26. Brown hair, steady eyes, corporal stripes on his sleeve. He looked tired but alert. He held a rifle loosely in one hand. He looked at Helena, looked past her at the others huddled in the barn. His expression changed, sharpened. "What's wrong?" Helena held up her hands, tried to demonstrate. Fingers would not move. She pointed to Sophie, who was still crying, pointed to the others who were affected. The soldier whose name tag read Brennan stepped closer. He examined Helena's hands without touching them, looked at the pale color, the stiff joints, the waxy texture. His face changed. Something flashed across it. Recognition and fear. Not fear of Helena, fear for her. He turned and shouted over his shoulder, "Get Morrison, now! Medical emergency." He looked back at Helena. His voice was gentle. "How long have they been like this?" Helena struggled to find the English words. "Since night. Midnight, maybe. Cannot move." Brennan's jaw tightened. He nodded. "Stay here. Help is coming." He left the door open. Cold air poured in, but somehow it seemed less oppressive than before. The act of asking for help had broken something inside Helena, some wall she had built between herself and reality. She had been taught that asking for mercy was weakness, but she was learning that sometimes survival required setting pride aside. 5 minutes later, another American arrived. Taller than Brennan, thin, wire-rimmed glasses, medical corpsman insignia on his sleeve. His name tag read Morrison. He carried a canvas medical bag. He entered the barn without hesitation, without fear, as if walking into a space full of enemy prisoners was the most natural thing in the world. He knelt beside Helena, set down his bag, removed his gloves. "I need to examine your hands. May I touch them?" Helena nodded. Morrison took her right hand in both of his. His touch was gentle, clinical. He pressed on her fingertips, checked her pulse at the wrist, examined the color and texture of her skin. He did this for each finger, then her left hand. Then he asked her questions. "Can you feel this?" He pressed harder. Helena shook her head. "How about this?" He pinched lightly. Nothing. He produced a small pin from his bag, pricked her fingertip. She felt nothing. Morrison's face remained neutral, but his eyes showed concern. He stood and addressed Brennan. "Stage 2 frostbite. Multiple casualties. We need warm water, clean cloths, and dry bandages. And we need better quarters. This barn is going to kill them." Brennan nodded. "I'll talk to the captain." Morrison turned to Helena. His voice was calm, professional, but not unkind. "You have frostbite, tissue damage from cold. If we treat it properly, most of your fingers should recover. But we need to start now. The longer we wait, the worse it gets. Do you understand?" Helena understood the words, but not the intention. He was going to help her. The enemy was going to provide medical care. For free. Without conditions. Because it was the right thing to do. It made no sense. Nothing made sense. Morrison examined the other women. Sophie. 3 others with severe symptoms. 5 more with moderate damage. He made notes on a small pad. Spoke quietly to Brennan, who listened and nodded. Then Morrison did something Helena would remember for the rest of her life. He removed his gloves. Not the thin medical gloves he had been wearing. His actual gloves. Thick wool with leather palms. The kind that kept hands warm even in freezing weather. He held them out to Helena. Take these. Keep them on until we get you somewhere warmer. Helena stared at the gloves, at Morrison's bare hands now exposed to the cold, at the simple, impossible act of sacrifice. Why Morrison's expression softened slightly. A hint of something soft and distant crossed his face. My sister died of pneumonia when she was 12. We couldn't afford heat during the Depression. Her hands got cold, then her lungs. Then she was gone. I was 14. Couldn't do anything to save her. He pressed the gloves into Helena's numb fingers. I can save you, so I will. He stood, picked up his bag, spoke to all the women in halting German. Help is coming. Stay calm. You will be all right. Then he left with Brennan. The door closed but did not lock. Helena sat holding Morrison's gloves. They were still warm from his hands. The enemy's hands, the hands of someone who had just given up his own comfort to help a prisoner he would never see again. Around her, the other women stirred. Anna stared at the closed door with an expression of utter confusion. He gave you his gloves, yes. Why would he do that? Helena had no answer. She pulled the gloves on carefully. They were too large. Her fingers did not bend enough to fill them properly. But they were warm, possibly miraculously warm. Sophie stopped crying. She watched Helena with enormous eyes. Maybe they told us lies about Americans. Anna's voice was harsh. They are trying to manipulate us, to make us grateful, to make us cooperate. Sophie shook her head. Nobody manipulates by giving away their gloves in winter. The three women sat in silence. Around them, the others huddled and waited. The temperature in the barn remained brutally cold. But something had changed. Some certainty had cracked. They had been taught that the enemy was inhuman, that mercy did not exist, that surrender meant suffering. But monsters do not kneel in frozen barns to check the pulse of prisoners. Monsters do not sacrifice their own warmth to help people who were trying to kill them last week. Helena flexed her fingers inside Morrison's gloves. Still no movement. But the warmth was beginning to penetrate, and with it a tiny spark of something she had not felt in months. Hope. 30 minutes later, Brennan returned with 3 other soldiers. They carried supplies, blankets, thermoses of hot water, clean cloths, bandages. Behind them came an officer, captain's bars on his collar. His name tag read Holloway. He looked at the women with an expression that was part annoyance and part resignation. He spoke to Brennan. You're telling me we have 15 female POWs with frostbite injuries? Yes, sir. Severe cases. Morrison says they need immediate warming and better shelter. We don't have facilities for female prisoners. Then we make facilities, sir. Geneva Convention requires medical care for POWs regardless of gender. Holloway sighed. He was a man who had dealt with too many problems already today, and this was just one more. But he was also a man who followed regulations. There's a textile warehouse 2 blocks from here. Still has intact windows and a generator for heat. Move them there. Get them warmed up. I'll file the paperwork later. Yes, sir. Holloway looked at the women. His expression softened slightly. You'll be taken care of. No one is going to hurt you. Cooperate with the medical staff and you'll be fine. He left. Brennan organized the supplies and the soldiers began distributing them. Hot water in tin cups, blankets draped over shoulders. Someone brought a kerosene heater and lit it in the corner. Morrison returned and began treating the severe cases. Helena was first. He directed her to remove the gloves carefully. Her fingers were still pale but no longer waxy. He placed her hands in a basin of lukewarm water. This will hurt when the feeling comes back. That's normal. That's good. Pain means the nerves are working. Helena braced herself. At first nothing, then a tingling, then a burning sensation that made her gasp. Morrison held her wrist gently, keeping her hands in the water. I know it hurts. Stay with it. You're doing fine. The pain intensified, like needles being driven into her fingertips, like fire under her skin. Helena bit her lip until she tasted blood. Tears ran down her face. But beneath the pain, something else. Movement. Tiny movement. The smallest flex of her index finger. Morrison saw it. His face brightened. Good. That's very good. Keep going. After 20 minutes, he removed her hands from the water, dried them gently with a soft cloth, wrapped them in clean bandages, elevated them on a folded blanket. You'll have full sensation back within a few days. There may be some permanent stiffness in cold weather, but you'll be able to use your hands, I promise. Helena looked at him, really looked at him. He was 28 years old. He had wire-rimmed glasses and thin hands and tired eyes. He had lost his sister to the cold, and now he spent his days saving the hands of enemy soldiers because he could not save hers. Thank you. Her English was clumsy but sincere. Morrison smiled slightly. You're welcome. He moved to Sophie, then the others. One by one he treated them all. Patient, methodical, kind. He worked for 3 hours without break. By noon they were being transferred to the warehouse. It was only 500 yards away, but the journey felt longer. Helena walked slowly, her bandaged hands held carefully against her chest. The other women followed, some supporting those who were weakest. The warehouse was enormous. High ceilings, rows of empty textile machinery, and windows, real windows with intact glass. A generator hummed in the corner, powering electric heaters spaced throughout the space. The temperature inside was 45 degrees, not warm, but survivable. After the barn, it felt like paradise. Straw mattresses had been laid out in rows. More blankets were stacked against the wall. There was even a makeshift latrine area partitioned with canvas sheets. Morrison supervised as the women settled in. He checked each set of bandaged hands, made notes, gave instructions to the guards about monitoring for signs of infection or renewed frostbite. Before he left, he paused by Helena's mattress. You're a pianist, aren't you, the way you held your hands? The way you looked at them. I've seen that look before. My sister wanted to play violin. Yes, I was a student. Before the war. You'll play again. The damage isn't permanent. It'll take time and practice, but you'll get it back. Helena wanted to believe him. But belief required trust, and trust required accepting that everything she had been taught was wrong. Morrison seemed to understand. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. Your personal items, the locket and letters. You'll get them back officially when you're released, but I thought you might want them now. He placed the envelope in her lap, then he left. Helena sat alone on the mattress, surrounded by 14 other women in various states of exhaustion and relief. She opened the envelope carefully with bandaged hands. The locket fell into her palm. Werner's face smiled up at her from the tiny photograph. Frozen in time. Forever 23. Forever optimistic. She had loved him. But she was beginning to understand that love was not enough. That loyalty to the dead could not come at the cost of the living. That Werner would want her to survive, even if it meant accepting help from those he had called enemies. Around her, the warehouse slowly warmed. Women were removing outer layers, lying down on mattresses, sleeping for the first time in days. Sophie still prayed, but her voice had changed. The panic was gone. Now there was only gratitude. Anna sat against the wall, watching the Americans come and go. Her face was unreadable, but her hands were no longer clenched in fists. She was learning the same lesson Helena was learning. That mercy existed even in war. That enemies could be human. That sometimes the only way to survive was to accept help from those you did not understand. Helena closed her eyes, felt the warmth beginning to seep into her bones, felt sensations slowly returning to her fingers, felt the terrible weight of propaganda beginning to lift. She had been taught that Americans were monsters. But monsters do not give away their gloves in winter. Monsters do not spend 3 hours treating the frostbite of enemy prisoners. Monsters do not risk their careers to move 15 women to a warmer building. She did not know what this meant, did not know how to reconcile it with everything she believed. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was alive, her hands were alive, and she owed that to the enemy. Everything else would have to wait. The transfer to Reims came 8 days later, December 4th, 1944. The frostbite had receded but not disappeared. Helena could move her fingers now slowly and with stiffness, but the cold had left its mark. Her hands ached in the mornings. The joints felt wrong. When she tried to flex them, the way she used to, the way a pianist must, they refused to bend completely. Morrison had warned her, you'll have full function back eventually, but it takes time. The tissue needs to heal. Don't push it. She tried to be patient. But patience was hard when your entire identity was bound up in 10 fingers that no longer obeyed perfectly. The truck convoy left Forbach at dawn, 15 women and 6 guards. The journey was supposed to take 3 hours. It took nearly 5 because the roads were choked with the military traffic moving east toward the front and refugees moving west away from it. Helena sat in the back of a canvas-covered truck, watching the landscape pass through the gap in the tailgate. France in winter, gray sky, bare trees, fields turned to mud, villages reduced to rubble, burned-out tanks sitting in ditches like monuments to futility. This was what victory looked like, she thought. This was the glorious Reich that propaganda had promised. Destruction, refugees, defeat. Beside her, Sophie clutched her rosary and prayed silently. Anna sat with her arms crossed, her face hard and closed. The others dozed or stared at nothing. They arrived at the Reims POW processing facility just after noon. It was larger than Forbach, more organized, more permanent. A former school building requisitioned by the U.S. Army's Prisoner of War Operations Division. 3 stories of brick and mortar surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. An American flag flew from a pole in the courtyard. The processing was thorough. Names verified against lists, index cards updated, medical examinations conducted, personal items logged again and cross-checked against the records from Forbach. Helena stood in line with the others, waiting her turn at each station. Registration, medical check, assignment. The Americans moved them through the system with the mechanical efficiency. No cruelty, but no warmth either. Just procedure. The medical examination was conducted by a different doctor this time. An older man with gray hair and a thick Brooklyn accent that Helena could barely understand. He examined her hands carefully, flexing each finger, checking range of motion, testing sensation with pinpricks and temperature changes. You're healing well. Keep moving them. Gentle exercises. Don't let the joints stiffen up. You should have full function back in 6 to 8 weeks. Thank you. He made a note on her chart. You play an instrument, don't you, piano? Thought so. Musicians always worry about their hands more than everyone else. He smiled slightly. You'll play again. Trust me. Helena wanted to believe him, but trust was still a foreign concept. Trust required faith in a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. The female compound was on the 2nd floor of the building, 30 beds in a long room that had once been a classroom, windows overlooking the courtyard, a bathroom with sinks and toilets and even showers, though the water was cold and the pressure was weak. It was luxury compared to the barn at Forbach. The routine began immediately. Wake at 6, breakfast at 7, work duty from 8 to noon, lunch at 12, free time until dinner at 6, lights out at 10. Work duty meant cleaning, washing floors, doing laundry, sorting donated clothing, light tasks that did not require heavy lifting or complex manual dexterity. Helena was assigned to laundry duty, folding clean sheets and pillowcases. It was mindless work, but it kept her hands moving, kept the joints from stiffening. The food was simple but adequate. Oatmeal in the morning, soup and bread at lunch, stew and bread at dinner. Nothing elaborate, nothing German, but it was hot and it filled the stomach, and that was more than they had eaten in months. On the 3rd day at Reims, December 7th, letters arrived. Not for everyone, just for those whose families could be located through Red Cross channels. Helena was not expecting anything. Her parents were dead, killed in the Dresden bombing she did not yet know about. She had no siblings. Werner was gone. There was no one left to write to her, but the guard called her name anyway. Fisher Helena, you have mail. She approached the distribution desk in confusion. A canvas mail sack sat on the table. The guard reached inside and pulled out a thick envelope wrapped in twine. Red Cross markings on the outside. Her name written in faded ink. It was heavy. She carried it back to her bunk and sat down staring at it. The return address was Werner's unit designation. Eastern Front. The postmark was October 1944, but the letters inside were older. Much older. She untied the twine with trembling hands. 12 letters spilled out. Werner's handwriting, she recognized it immediately. The careful, precise script he had learned in gymnasium. The way he crossed his sevens with a line through the middle. She arranged them by date. The earliest was from March 1943. The most recent was dated July 10, 1943. Over 16 months old. They had been forwarded through military mail channels delayed by combat and chaos and the slow collapse of German logistics. Now they arrived all at once, a packet of ghosts. Helena opened the first letter. Werner's voice came through clearly. Cheerful, optimistic, full of plans for after the war. We'll get married in Dresden. You'll have your debut at the Staatskapelle. I'll be in the front row, the proudest man in the city. We'll have a small apartment near the conservatory. You can practice while I study engineering. It will be perfect. She read each letter in order, watched his optimism slowly fade as the months passed. March, April, May, June, July. The tone changed. The descriptions of the Eastern Front became darker, more honest. He stopped talking about victory and started talking about survival. The final letter was dated July 10th, 1943. It was shorter than the others, more urgent. My dearest Helena, we are preparing for a major operation near Kursk. It should begin any day now. They say it will be the decisive battle of the war. I hope they are right. I hope this is the beginning of the end, one way or another. I am tired, Helena. So tired. But I think of you and it gives me strength. If I survive this, I will come home. If I do not, please know that I loved you with everything I had. You were the best part of my life. Play beautifully. Live well. Remember me. With all my love, Werner. Helena read the last line 3 times. Remember me. As if he knew. As if he understood that Kursk would be his end. The Battle of Kursk had been the largest tank battle in history. July and August 1943. The Wehrmacht's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. And it had failed. Catastrophically. Werner's unit had been in the thick of it. The final letter was dated 5 days into the battle. No letters after July 10th meant only one thing. He had died there. Burned alive in a tank, or shot by a sniper, or blown apart by artillery. It did not matter how. What mattered was that he had been dead for 17 months while she still carried his photograph and wrote him letters in her mind and planned a future that would never exist. She sat on her bunk holding the letters and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not a clean break, a slow fracture. Grief mixed with relief, mixed with guilt for feeling relieved. Werner was dead. She was free. Free to stop hoping. Free to stop waiting. Free to accept that the past was gone and only the present remained. But the present was a POW camp in occupied France, and her parents were dead, and her city was destroyed, and she had nothing left except hands that barely worked in a future that was completely blank. She stopped eating. Not consciously, not as a decision. She simply could not bring herself to care about food when everything else felt so pointless. Sophie noticed first, then Anna. They tried to coerce her, tried to shame her, tried to bribe her with extra rations. Nothing worked. On the 4th day, Morrison appeared. He was making rounds checking on the medical cases from Forbach. He noticed immediately that Helena had lost weight. You need to eat. What, because starving yourself won't bring him back? Helena looked up sharply. How do you know about him? Morrison sat down on the bunk across from hers. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the light from the window. I saw the photograph in your locket. I'm not blind, and I've seen that look before. The look of someone who lost everything and doesn't know how to keep going. He was quiet for a moment. Then he continued. My brother died at Normandy, June 6th. He was a medic like me. Got hit by shrapnel while treating wounded soldiers on Omaha Beach. Died doing his job. I got the telegram 3 weeks later. For a while I thought, what's the point? He was the good one, the brave one. Why am I still here? Helena said nothing, but she was listening. You know what I realized? He died. I didn't. I don't get to choose that. But I do get to choose what I do with the time I have. I can waste it feeling guilty for surviving. Or I can live for both of us. Make his death mean something by making my life count. He stood up. Your fiancé, what was his name? Werner. Werner would want you to survive, Helena. He didn't write those letters so you could starve yourself in a prison camp. He wrote them because he wanted you to live. So live. Eat. Heal. Play piano again. Make his sacrifice worth something. Morrison left. Helena sat holding Werner's letters. She read the last one again. Play beautifully. Live well. Remember me. That night she ate dinner. Stew and bread. It tasted like nothing, but she forced it down. One bite, then another, then the whole bowl. Sophie squeezed her hand. Good, that's good. Anna said nothing, but her expression softened slightly. Helena slept that night without nightmares, and in the morning she woke with a strange new feeling. Not happiness, not hope exactly, but something close to acceptance. Werner was gone. She was alive, and she had to figure out what that meant. December 16th, 1944, the day everything changed again. The Battle of the Bulge began before dawn, a massive German offensive in the Ardennes, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied lines and recapture the initiative. It was bold, it was ambitious, it was doomed to fail. But in the short term, it created chaos. American forces were caught off guard, supply lines were disrupted, reserves were rushed to the front, and POW camps, which had been low-priority operations, suddenly became even lower priority. The effects on Rains were immediate. Heating fuel was rationed. The generator ran only 4 hours a day instead of 24. Food portions shrank. Medical supplies were delayed because transport trucks were needed at the front. Guard presence was reduced as soldiers were redeployed to combat units. The temperature inside the compound dropped. Not to the levels of the Forbach barn, but enough to be dangerous. 45 degrees became 40, then 35. Breath became visible even indoors. Windows frosted over. Water in the bathroom sinks froze overnight. Helena felt the cold in her hands first. The stiffness returned. The ache became sharp pain. The fingers that had been slowly healing suddenly felt fragile again. She tried her exercises, flexing and extending, but the cold made it difficult. Around her, the other women suffered similarly. Sophie's fingers, which had lost 3 tips to frostbite, became hypersensitive to temperature. She wrapped them in scraps of cloth and tried not to cry. Anna's hands had recovered fully, but now she watched them, obsessively terrified the damage would return. The compound became a test of will. 15 women trying to stay warm with inadequate blankets and minimal heat. They organized themselves. Anna took charge, creating a rotation system where women slept in shifts near the few functioning radiators. Sophie led prayers every evening, her voice strong despite the cold. Our Father who art in heaven, give us this day our daily bread. Deliver us from evil. Helena found herself becoming part of the group in a way she had not been before. She helped organize the blanket sharing, helped monitor the weaker women for signs of hypothermia, helped keep spirits up with stories of Dresden before the war. She was no longer just a pianist mourning her lost future. She was a survivor learning to live in the present. But not everyone adapted. Some of the women became bitter, resentful, angry at their captors for the cold and the hunger and the uncertainty. One woman in particular, Greta Hoffman, 26 years old from Munich, became increasingly vocal about her hatred for the Americans. They are starving us deliberately. They are freezing us. They want us to die so they don't have to deal with us. Anna tried to reason with her. They are dealing with a major offensive. Resources are scarce. They are doing what they can. They are the enemy. They owe us nothing. We should not be grateful for scraps. Helena stayed out of these arguments. But she could not help noticing the difference between Greta's ideology and her own evolving understanding. Greta saw only enemies. Helena was beginning to see people, flawed people, overwhelmed people, but people nonetheless. The tension came to a head on December 22nd. The guards were changing shifts, a process that normally took 15 minutes, but was now taking longer because of reduced staffing. There was a window of perhaps 20 minutes when the compound was less closely monitored than usual. Greta saw her chance. She slipped out through a side door that had a broken lock. She was gone before anyone noticed. Sophie discovered her absence during evening count. She told Anna. Anna told the guards. An immediate search began. 2 hours later, they found Greta 2 miles from the camp, collapsed in a drainage ditch. She had been caught in freezing rain. Her clothes were soaked through. Her core temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. Both hands were severely frostbitten. Much worse than anything Helena had experienced at Forbach. They brought her back to the compound. Morrison was called. He worked for 3 hours trying to save her hands, but the damage was too extensive. 3 fingers on her right hand had to be amputated, 2 on her left. The tissue was already dead. Gangrene was setting in. He had no choice. Helena watched through the doorway of the medical room as Morrison performed the amputations. His hands were steady. His face was grim. He took no pleasure in it. He was simply doing what had to be done. Greta, delirious from pain and fever, screamed at him. You did this to me. You and your kind. You destroyed my hands. Morrison said nothing. He finished the procedure, bandaged the stumps carefully, administered morphine. Then he left without a word. Helena found him later sitting alone in a hallway, his head in his hands. He looked up when she approached. His eyes were hollow. I became a medic to save people, not to cut them apart. She sat down beside him. You saved her life. The gangrene would have killed her. She hates me for it, because she can't accept that she did this to herself. She chose ideology over survival. She chose pride over common sense. You gave her a chance to live. What she does with it is not her responsibility. Morrison looked at her with something like surprise. When did you become wise? When I stopped being stupid? They sat in silence for a while. Then Morrison spoke again. When my sister got sick, my parents tried everything. Home remedies, prayer, waiting for it to pass. By the time they took her to a hospital, it was too late. Pneumonia had damaged her lungs too badly. She died 3 days later. I was 14. I watched her die because my family was too proud to ask for help until it was too late. He took off his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. I became a medic because I never wanted to watch someone die from something preventable ever again. But sometimes I can't save them. Sometimes the damage is already done. And that is the hardest part of this job. Helena understood. Greta had made her choice. She had chosen escape over patience, pride over pragmatism. And now she would live the rest of her life with 5 fingers missing. A permanent reminder that ideology has consequences. But Helena had made a different choice. She had chosen to ask for help, to accept mercy from enemies, to trust Morrison and Brennan when everything in her training said not to. And because of that choice, her hands were healing, slowly, imperfectly, but healing. That night, Helena wrote in the small diary she had been keeping. Just a few lines, simple observations, but also a kind of prayer. December 22nd, 1944. Greta lost 5 fingers because she ran. I kept all 10 because I stayed. Pride kills. Humility saves. Werner, if you can hear me, wherever you are, I hope you understand. I am choosing life. Even if it means accepting help from those you called enemies. Even if it means letting go of everything we believed. I am choosing life. Christmas Eve arrived cold and gray. The Battle of the Bulge was still raging. The camp was still undersupplied. The women were still cold and hungry and uncertain. But something shifted that evening. The guards, reduced to a skeleton crew, brought extra rations. Not much, but chocolate bars from their own care packages, cigarettes for those who smoked, a bottle of cognac that was passed around the compound, each woman taking a small sip. Brennan appeared at the door of the female quarters. He looked uncomfortable, uncertain. He addressed the room in his careful, heavily accented German. It is Christmas Eve. You are far from home. So are we. War does not stop for holidays, but we can still remember why we are human. There will be a service in the chapel downstairs at 8 o'clock. You are welcome to attend if you wish. No one will force you, but the invitation is open. He left before anyone could respond. The women looked at each other. Some were suspicious, some were indifferent, but Sophie stood immediately. I am going. Anyone who wants to join me is welcome. Helena stood. So did Anna. So did 6 others. They went downstairs to the small chapel that had been set up in what was once the school's assembly hall. American soldiers were already there, 20 or 30 of them. They stood when the women entered. Brennan gestured to empty pews near the front. The women sat. An army chaplain led the service. He spoke in English, but the meaning was clear. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men. In the midst of war, a reminder of what we are fighting for. Not conquest, not glory, but the hope that someday enemies can become neighbors again. Sophie led the German women in singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night. Her voice was clear and strong. The American soldiers joined in singing in English. Holy night, all is calm, all is bright. For a few minutes there were no Germans and no Americans, just people singing about peace in a world at war. After the service, Brennan approached Helena. He held a small photograph in his hand. He showed it to her without speaking. A young girl, maybe 12 years old. Dark hair and braids, a bright smile. She stood in front of a Christmas tree holding a wrapped present. My sister Mary. This was her last Christmas. 1935. She died 3 months later. Helena looked at the photograph, looked at Brennan's face, saw the grief that time had softened, but not erased. I am sorry for your loss. Brennan nodded. That is why I do this, why I help. Every time I see a prisoner suffering from cold, I see Mary. Every time I prevent someone from freezing, I feel like I am saving her. Even though I know I cannot, even though I know she is gone. Helena understood. Morrison saved hands because he could not save his sister's lungs. Brennan provided warmth because he could not warm Mary's frozen body. They were both trying to redeem the past by changing the present. And Helena was the beneficiary of their unresolved grief. She held up her hands, still scarred, still stiff, but functional, getting better every day. Thank you. For my hands, for my life. Brennan looked away. Just doing my job. No, you are doing more than your job. You are choosing mercy when you could choose indifference. That is not protocol. That is humanity. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Brennan spoke again. When this war is over, what will you do? I do not know. My city is destroyed. My family is gone. My fiancé is dead. I have nothing to go back to. You have your hands. You can play piano. That is something. Maybe. If I can remember how, you will remember. Muscle memory does not forget. The fingers will remember even if the heart does not. Helena hoped he was right. January 8th, 1945. They were transferred again, this time to Camp 32 near Chalons-en-Champagne. It was supposed to be an improvement, a more permanent facility with better heating and more resources. But when they arrived, they discovered the heating system was broken. The building had been a Wehrmacht supply depot before American forces captured it. The retreating Germans had sabotaged the furnaces before abandoning the position. Scorched earth. Deny the enemy anything useful. The Americans had not realized the extent of the damage. They thought it was a temporary malfunction. It was not. The heating system was beyond field repair. Parts were needed, parts that would not arrive for weeks. The first night, the temperature inside dropped to 25 degrees. The second night, 20. The third night, 15. Helena felt the cold returning to her hands, that familiar numbness, that terrifying absence of sensation. She tried exercises, tried blowing warm breath on her fingers, tried everything Morrison had taught her, but the cold was relentless. She woke on the fourth morning and could not bend her fingers. Not completely, not the way she needed to. Panic flooded through her, not again, not after everything. Not after she had chosen life and accepted help and done everything right. She found Anna already awake organizing the other women. They had learned. They knew what to do. They packed themselves together in the center of the room, creating a tight cluster of bodies sharing warmth. They rotated positions every hour so no one stayed on the cold edges too long. They sang to keep spirits up and to generate activity that produced heat. But it was not enough. The cold was too intense. The building was too poorly insulated. They were losing ground. Helena knew they had to ask for help again. But this time it felt different. This time it felt like failure. They had already been saved once. How many times could you ask for mercy before it became dependence, before it became weakness? Anna made the decision. She walked to the door and pounded on it until a guard came. She spoke clearly in her improving English. We need help. The cold is too much. We cannot survive this. The guard, a young private who looked barely 18, seemed uncertain. I will tell the officer. Please hurry. Some of us have had frostbite before. It is returning. The guard left. An hour passed, then another. Helena sat with her hands tucked under her arms, trying desperately to preserve what warmth remained. Around her, 14 other women did the same. Waiting, hoping, praying. Finally, footsteps in the hallway. The door opened. Captain Holloway entered with 2 engineers and Morrison. Holloway surveyed the room, saw 15 women huddled together in the center, shivering despite their best efforts. Saw the frost on the windows. Saw the desperate situation. He turned to the engineers. Can you fix the heating system? Not without parts, sir. The Germans destroyed it thoroughly. We need replacement components that won't arrive for at least 2 weeks. Then we improvise. Portable heaters, extra generators, insulation materials, blankets, whatever it takes. No one dies of cold in my camp. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Morrison was already moving through the room, checking hands. He reached Helena and examined her fingers carefully. His face was tight with concern. Not as bad as Forbach, but bad enough. We caught it earlier this time. He looked at Holloway. Sir, we need to move them. This building is not viable. Where do you suggest, Corporal? The officers' barracks has better insulation and functional heating. We move the officers to temporary quarters and give this space to the prisoners. Holloway stared at him. You want me to displace American officers for enemy POWs? I want you to follow the Geneva Convention and provide adequate shelter for prisoners in your custody. Sir. The two men locked eyes, then Holloway sighed. Do it. I will handle the complaints. Within 3 hours, the situation had changed. Portable heaters arrived. Engineers installed makeshift insulation using canvas tarps and packing materials. Extra blankets were distributed. And most importantly, the attitude had shifted. This was no longer a temporary inconvenience to be endured. This was a crisis to be solved. Holloway himself oversaw the operation. He moved through the building, checking progress, demanding updates, pushing his men to work faster. He spoke to the prisoners directly through a translator. You will be warm tonight. I promise you that. This is unacceptable. You are prisoners, but you are also human beings under my protection. I failed you. That stops now. Helena watched this unfold with something like wonder. Holloway was not doing this because he liked them or felt sorry for them. He was doing it because it was his job, because the regulations said so, because he had taken an oath to uphold certain standards, and those standards applied to everyone, even enemies. By evening, the temperature had risen to 40 degrees. By midnight, 45. It was still cold, but it was survivable. Helena could move her fingers, slowly, painfully. But they moved. She found Brennan later helping to install insulation in a window frame. She approached him carefully. Thank you. Again. Brennan looked at her. His face was tired. He had been working for 16 hours straight, but he managed a small smile. You know, at some point you are going to have to stop thanking me. Why? Because I am just doing what anyone should do. You are not a burden. You are a person who needs help. And I can help, so I do. That is not heroism. That is just being human. Helena thought about Greta, who had chosen pride over pragmatism and lost 5 fingers. Thought about the propaganda that said accepting help from enemies was betrayal. Thought about all the lies she had been taught. Then she thought about Morrison giving her his gloves. Brennan fighting for warmer quarters. Holloway displacing his own officers to save prisoners. These were not the actions of savages. These were not the behaviors of subhuman creatures. These were the actions of people who believed that mercy mattered, that rules existed to protect the weak, that doing the right thing was more important than doing the easy thing. I was taught that you were monsters, Helena said quietly, that Americans were incapable of compassion, that your kindness was manipulation. But I was wrong, or rather I was lied to, and I believed the lies because I did not know better. She looked at her hands, still scarred, still imperfect, but alive, functional, healing. You saved my hands twice now. You gave me back my future. I do not know how to repay that. Brennan was quiet for a long moment, then he spoke. Mary would have been your age now if she had lived. 20, maybe 21. She wanted to be a teacher, wanted to help children learn. That was her dream. He looked at Helena directly. Live well. Use those hands. Create something beautiful. That is how you repay us. Not with gratitude, but with life, with purpose, with music. Make Mary's death mean something by making your survival count. Helena nodded. She could not speak. Her throat was too tight. But she understood. She was not just living for herself anymore. She was living for Werner, who died at Kursk, for Morrison's unnamed sister, who froze to death during the Depression, for Brennan's sister Mary, who died of cold and pneumonia in 1936, for Morrison's brother David, who bled out on Omaha Beach, for all the people who did not get a second chance. She was living for them, and she would make it count. That night, Helena slept without fear for the first time since capture. The room was warm enough, her hands were safe, and she had finally accepted the truth that changed everything. The enemy had shown her more mercy than her own government ever had. The people she was taught to hate had saved her life twice. And that meant everything she believed about loyalty and honor and duty was wrong. The war was not over. The camp was still harsh. The future was still uncertain. But Helena had learned the most important lesson of all. Mercy transcends nationality. Compassion crosses borders. And sometimes the only way to survive is to accept help from those you do not understand. She would remember this. For the rest of her life, she would remember. And she would teach others, because small acts of kindness echo through time in ways that no one can predict. Winter 1944 had broken her hands, but it had also opened her eyes, and that perhaps was the greater gift. Spring arrived slowly in 1945. March brought rain instead of snow. April brought mud instead of frost. And May brought news that everyone had been expecting, but no one quite believed until they heard it officially. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Helena heard the announcement on May 8th while working in the camp library, a small room on the first floor where donated books were sorted and cataloged for prisoner use. The loudspeaker crackled to life, an American voice speaking English. Then a translator repeating the words in German. Effective immediately, all hostilities between Allied forces and German forces have ceased. The Reich has surrendered unconditionally. The war is over. Helena set down the book she was holding, looked at her hands, flexed the fingers slowly. They moved now, not perfectly. There was still stiffness in cold weather, still occasional pain in the joints. But they worked. She could grip, she could type, she could play simple pieces on the piano they had found in the chapel. She had survived, against all odds, against all probability. She had made it to the end. But the end of what the war was over, but her life was still uncertain. She was still a prisoner, still stateless, still without family or home or future. Around her, other prisoners reacted differently. Some wept with relief. Some celebrated quietly. Some sat in stunned silence, unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Anna appeared in the doorway. Her face was unreadable. So, it is finished. Yes. What happens to us now, I do not know. What happened was repatriation, the process of returning prisoners to their home countries. It began immediately. Announcements were posted, registration forms were distributed, prisoners were interviewed to determine their origins and verify their identities. The Americans were efficient. They had processed thousands of prisoners already. They knew the procedures. They had the logistics worked out. Within 2 weeks, transfers would begin. But repatriation presented problems. Germany was no longer a unified country. It was divided into occupation zones controlled by the 4 Allied powers: American, British, French, Soviet. Where you were sent depended on where you were from. Helena was from Dresden, Soviet zone. The thought made her stomach clench with anxiety. She had heard stories about what the Soviets did to German civilians, especially women. The propaganda might have lied about Americans, but it had been telling the truth about the Russians. Anna was from Hamburg, British zone. She would be safe, relatively speaking. Sophie was from Bavaria, American zone. She would be fine. But Helena would be sent east, into the hands of an occupying force that had even less reason to show mercy than the Americans. Her hands trembled as she filled out the repatriation form. Destination Dresden, Soviet occupation zone. Morrison found her later that day. He had been making final rounds checking on medical cases before transfers began. He noticed her distress immediately. "What is wrong? I am being sent to the Soviet zone." "Dresden." Morrison was quiet for a moment. His face showed concern. "I cannot change that. The zones are determined by international agreement." "I know, but I can give you something." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. "My address in Pennsylvania. If you ever need help, if you ever make it to America, write to me." Helena took the envelope, stared at it. "Why would you do this?" "Because you survived. Because your hands healed. Because I want to know that the people I saved actually made it. That it mattered. It mattered. Then prove it. Live well. Play piano. Build a life. And if you ever need help, ask. I learned something from you, Helena. I learned that asking for help is not weakness. It is wisdom." He left before she could respond. Helena held the envelope carefully. An address in Pennsylvania. A lifeline to a future she could not yet imagine. She tucked it into her coat pocket next to Werner's last letter. The transfer came on May 15th. Helena and 5 other women bound for the Soviet zone were loaded into a truck convoy. The journey would take several days, multiple checkpoints, multiple inspections, multiple opportunities for things to go wrong. Anna and Sophie came to say goodbye. Anna, who had been so suspicious at first, embraced Helena tightly. Survive. That is an order. I will try. Do not try. Do it. You made it this far. Do not waste it. Sophie pressed something into Helena's hand. Her rosary beads, the ones her mother had given her, for protection, for luck, for remembering that miracles happen even in war. I cannot take this. Yes, you can. I do not need them anymore. I have seen enough miracles to believe without beads. But you are going somewhere dark. You will need them more than I do. Helena clutched the beads, felt the smooth wood between her fingers, nodded because she could not speak. The convoy left at dawn. Helena sat in the back of a truck watching Reims disappear behind her, watching the camp that had been her prison and her salvation, watching the last piece of stability vanish into the distance. The journey east was long and complicated, through checkpoints where American soldiers handed them over to British soldiers who handed them over to Soviet soldiers, through ruined cities and destroyed bridges and roads cratered by bombs, through a landscape that looked like the end of the world. They arrived in Dresden on June 3, 1945. Helena had prepared herself. She knew the city had been bombed. She knew there would be damage. But nothing prepared her for the reality. Dresden was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed. Gone. Erased. 90% of the city center had been obliterated in the firebombing of February 13th and 14th. What remained was rubble and ash and the hollow shells of buildings too stubborn to collapse completely. The Frauenkirche, the great church that had dominated the skyline, was a pile of blackened stone. The Semperoper, the opera house where Helena had dreamed of performing, was a burned-out ruin. The conservatory where she had studied was simply not there anymore, just an empty space where a building used to be. Her apartment building, the place where she had grown up, was rubble. She stood in front of the address and could not even tell which pile of bricks had been her home. A neighbor recognized her. Frau Hessler, an elderly woman who had lived on the third floor. She was living in a refugee center now, a converted school gymnasium filled with cots and displaced people. Helena, you are alive. I thought you were dead. Where are my parents? Frau Hessler's face crumpled. I am sorry, child. They died in the bombing. February 13th. They were in the apartment when the firestorm came. It was very quick. They would not have suffered. Helena stood very still. She had known. Somewhere deep down she had known. But hearing it confirmed was different. Final. Irreversible. What about my brother Hans? He survived. He was evacuated to your cousin in Munich before the bombing. I have an address if you want it. Yes, please. Frau Hessler wrote down the address on a scrap of paper. Munich, American zone. Hans was safe. At least there was that. Helena spent 3 days in Dresden. 3 days wandering through ruins. 3 days trying to find anything recognizable. Anything that connected her to the life she used to have. On the third day she found her childhood church, St. Mary's. It was damaged but still standing. The roof was partially gone. The windows were blown out. But the walls remained. And inside, miraculously, the piano. It was an old upright, not a Steinway, not a concert instrument, but it had survived. Covered in dust and plaster, but intact. Helena sat down at the bench, placed her fingers on the keys. They felt foreign, wrong. She had not played in over a year. Her hands had changed. The stiffness was still there. The scars were permanent. She tried to play. Pressed down on middle C. The note sounded slightly out of tune but recognizable. She tried a scale. C major. Her fingers stumbled. Missed notes. Could not stretch to the octaves the way they used to. Frustration flooded through her. Rage at the war. Rage at the cold. Rage at everything that had been taken from her. She wanted to slam the keys, to break the piano the way everything else had been broken. But then she remembered. Morrison's words. Brennan's words. Your hands will remember even if your heart does not. She started again. Slower this time. Simpler. Not a complex piece. Just a melody. Brahms' Lullaby. The first piece her mother had taught her when she was 6 years old. Her fingers found the notes. Slowly, haltingly, with mistakes. But they found them, muscle memory awakening after a long sleep. The piano responded. The sound filled the empty church. Simple, imperfect, but music. Helena played until her hands cramped, played until tears ran down her face, played until she remembered why she had ever loved this in the first place. Not for Werner, not for the conservatory, not for some imagined future of concert halls and applause. For this, for the simple act of creating sound, for the connection between thought and motion and music, for the proof that something beautiful could still exist in a world of ruins. She stopped playing, looked at her hands, scarred, stiff, imperfect, but functional, live, capable. Morrison had saved these hands. Brennan had protected them. Holloway had fought for them. And now Helena had to decide what to do with them. She could stay in Dresden, try to rebuild in the Soviet zone, live under occupation, scratch out an existence in the ruins, or she could leave, go to Munich, find her brother, start over in the American zone, where at least she knew the occupiers were capable of mercy. The choice was obvious. She left Dresden the next day, carried nothing but the clothes on her back, Werner's letters, Morrison's address, and Sophie's rosary beads. Everything else was gone, but everything else had been weighing her down anyway. The journey to Munich took 2 weeks, hitchhiking on military trucks, walking when no rides were available, sleeping in displaced persons camps, eating at Red Cross stations, moving west towards something resembling a future. She arrived in Munich in late June, found her cousin's address, a small apartment in a neighborhood that had been spared the worst of the bombing. Her brother Hans answered the door, 14 years old now, taller than she remembered. He stared at her for a moment, then burst into tears. "Helena, I thought you were dead. I almost was, several times, but I am here now." They held each other in the doorway, two orphans, the only family either of them had left. Helena stayed in Munich, found work as a piano teacher. There was demand. Families wanted their children to learn music again, to reclaim some piece of normalcy, to believe that culture could survive war. She taught in the apartment, started with 5 students, then 10, then 20. Her hands were not strong enough for concert performance. The stiffness prevented the kind of virtuosity required for Rachmaninoff or Liszt, but they were strong enough to teach, strong enough to guide young fingers through scales and arpeggios and simple pieces. She was good at it, patient, encouraging. She understood what it meant to struggle, to have your hands fail you, to work through pain and frustration toward small victories. Her students loved her. Their parents recommended her to friends. Within a year, she had a waiting list. In 1947, she met Richard Strauss, not the composer, a dentist with the same unfortunate name. He was kind, practical, a widower with no children who wanted companionship more than passion. They married in 1948. It was not the grand romance she had imagined with Werner, but it was solid, safe, real. They immigrated to America in 1952. Richard had family in Philadelphia, distant cousins who had fled Germany in the 1930s. They sponsored the paperwork, helped them settle. Richard opened a dental practice. Helena started teaching piano again. By 1955, she had 40 students. By 1960, she was one of the most sought-after piano teachers in Philadelphia. By 1970, she had taught over 200 students. She had 2 daughters. She named them Marie and Sophie, after Anna Richter, whose middle name was Marie and Sophie Klein, the women who had survived with her, the women who had taught her that strength comes from accepting help. She stayed in touch with Anna and Sophie, letters back and forth across the Atlantic. Anna had become a teacher in Hamburg. Sophie had become a school principal in Bavaria. They visited once in 1968. 3 middle-aged women sitting in a Philadelphia kitchen, drinking coffee, remembering the winter of 1944 with a mixture of horror and gratitude. "We should have died," Anna said, "statistically, mathematically. We should have frozen in that barn, but we did not." Sophie replied, "Because we asked for help, because Americans chose mercy over indifference." Helena looked at her hands, still scarred, still stiff in cold weather, still imperfect. "Because Morrison gave me his gloves, because Brennan fought for warm quarters, because Holloway believed rules mattered even for enemies. We survived because individuals chose to be human. The years passed, 1970, 1980. Helena's students grew up, became teachers themselves, had children of their own who came to Helena for lessons. 40 students became 400 students across 3 generations. Each one learned piano. But each one also learned the story of the winter of 1944, the story of the moment Helena's fingers stopped moving and American soldiers chose to help instead of ignore. Some students asked questions. Why did they help you? You were the enemy. Helena always gave the same answer. Because mercy is stronger than hate, because compassion crosses borders, because they saw people in pain and responded with humanity. That is what separates civilization from barbarism. Not weapons, not ideology, but the choice to help when help is needed. In October 1985, Helena received an invitation. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum was opening in Washington, D.C. There would be a special ceremony honoring acts of mercy during wartime. Helena's story had been documented by historians in the 1970s as part of an oral history project. Now they wanted her to speak. She almost declined. She was 60 years old. She was not a public speaker. She was just a piano teacher from Philadelphia. But her daughter Marie convinced her. Mom, this is important. People need to hear this. They need to know that mercy existed even in the darkest times. So Helena went to Washington, prepared a short speech, stood before 200 people, and told her story. The elderly woman stood before 200 faces in the Holocaust Memorial Museum, Washington, D.C., October 1985. She raised her hands for the audience to see, scarred, slightly crooked, but alive. These hands stopped moving on November 28, 1944. I was certain they would never move again. But they did. Because of decisions made by American soldiers I had been taught to fear. She told them everything. The barn at Forbach, the frostbite, Morrison's gloves, Brennan's advocacy, Holloway's orders, the warehouse, the Christmas service, Camp 32, the crisis that almost killed them again, the engineers installing insulation, the slow journey from prisoner to teacher to American citizen. When she finished, the audience stood. Applause filled the room, but Helena was not looking at the crowd. She was looking at 2 men sitting in the front row. She had not known they would be there, had not been told. But there they were. William Morrison, 69 years old now, retired doctor, silver hair, the same wire-rimmed glasses, the same gentle expression. Thomas Brennan, 67 years old, former city councilman from Detroit, gray hair, steady eyes, the same quiet strength. The ceremony ended. People filtered out. Helena descended from the podium on shaking legs. Morrison stood first, then Brennan. They met in the aisle. For a moment, no one spoke. 41 years had passed. They were different people now. Older, changed by time, but the connection remained. Morrison broke the silence. I kept your gloves. The ones I gave you. You left them at Reims when you were transferred. I have carried them with me ever since. He pulled them from his jacket pocket. Worn leather, faded wool, 41 years old. He held them out. Helena took them, felt the weight of memory. You gave them to me when your own hands were bare. Morrison nodded. They reminded me why I became a doctor, to save people, even when it is hard, even when it seems impossible. Brennan spoke next. His voice was rough with emotion. I went into politics after the war. City council, housing department, made sure Detroit had winter shelters with heat, made sure no one froze on the streets the way Mary froze. Every person we saved, I thought of you, of the 15 women in that barn, of the choice we made to help instead of ignore. Helena looked at both of them, these men who had saved her life, who had given her a future, who had chosen mercy when indifference would have been easier. You saved my hands. But you did more than that. You showed me that humanity survives even in war, that enemies can be people, that mercy transcends ideology. She held up her hands, still scarred, still imperfect. Because of you, I have taught 400 students. Because of you, I have 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. Because of you, music still exists in my life. Morrison removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly. His eyes were wet. That is all I ever wanted. To know that it mattered, to know that saving you meant something. Brennan pulled out a photograph. Helena recognized it immediately. The 15 women from Forbach, standing in front of the textile warehouse, taken by an army photographer in December 1944. But this photograph was different. It had been annotated, names written next to faces, dates added, life summaries. Anna Richter, teacher Hamburg, 3 children, died 1998. Sophie Klein, school principal Bavaria, 5 children, still living. And 12 others, each one with a story, each one with a life that continued past 1945. Brennan pointed to the bottom of the photograph. Someone had done the mathematics. 15 women saved. Combined descendants as of 1985, 47 children, 89 grandchildren. Total 136 people who exist because we chose mercy. Helena stared at the number. 136 lives, all branching out from one decision. One moment when Morrison gave her his gloves. One moment when Brennan argued for warmer quarters. One moment when Holloway chose to follow regulations that protected the weak. 136 reasons why mercy matters. The 3 of them sat in the museum's cafe, drank coffee, talked for hours, shared stories, filled in the gaps, learned what had happened to each other in the 41 years since Forbach. Morrison had become a surgeon, specialized in cold weather injuries, developed new treatment protocols, saved thousands of hands. Everyone made him think of Helena. Brennan had fought for housing rights, winter shelter programs, heat assistance for low-income families. Every person he helped was Mary. Every life saved was redemption. Helena had taught piano, raised daughters, became an American citizen, lived the life Werner had wanted for her, played beautifully, lived well, remembered. As the sun set over Washington, they stood to leave. Morrison handed Helena a business card. If you ever need anything, if your hands ever trouble you, call me. I owe you that much. You owe me nothing. You saved my life. No, you saved mine. You showed me that what I do matters. That is worth more than you can imagine. They parted with promises to stay in touch, promises they would keep. Helena returned to Philadelphia, returned to teaching. But something had changed. The story was no longer just hers. It was documented, recorded, shared. In 1994, a historian named Sarah Mitchell published a book about female POWs. Helena's story was a full chapter. The book won awards, generated interest, led to a documentary. In 1997, a monument was erected at the site of the Forbach textile warehouse. It showed 2 figures, one kneeling to examine another's hands. No uniforms, no flags, just 2 people, one helping, one being helped. The inscription read, "In the midst of war mercy, November 1944. 15 women survived because compassion transcended conflict." Helena attended the dedication. She was 72 years old. Anna was there. Sophie was there. 6 other survivors, and dozens of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Morrison came. Brennan came. They stood together, 3 elderly people who had been young once in a war that seemed like another lifetime. A local French official spoke. American military representatives spoke. German diplomats spoke. Everyone talked about the importance of mercy, the necessity of compassion, the power of small acts. But Helena knew the truth was simpler than that. Morrison had given her his gloves because his unnamed sister died of cold. Brennan had fought for heat because Mary froze. Holloway had followed regulations because he believed rules existed to protect people, not to punish them. They were not saints. They were people who had lost things and were trying to prevent others from losing the same things. That was all. That was everything. Helena died in 2006, 81 years old, peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family. Her funeral was held in Philadelphia. 200 people attended, students, colleagues, friends, family. Anna had died in 2001. Sophie was there, 80 years old, still, sharp, still strong. Morrison had died in 2003, but his daughter attended carrying her father's worn leather gloves. Brennan had died in 1998. His son came bringing the annotated photograph. Helena's daughter Marie spoke at the service. She told the story her mother had told hundreds of times. The barn, the frostbite, the gloves, the mercy. Then she said something new, something Helena had written in a letter shortly before her death. My mother wrote this 6 months ago. She asked me to read it at her funeral. It says, I have lived a good life, not the life I planned, not the life I expected, but a good life. I have taught music. I have raised children. I have been loved and have loved in return. All of this exists because 2 American soldiers chose mercy over indifference, because Morrison gave me his gloves, because Brennan fought for warmth, because Holloway believed rules mattered. I was the enemy, but they saw me as human. That made all the difference. Tell them thank you. Tell them it mattered. Tell them their mercy echoed through time and created something beautiful. The funeral ended. People filed past the casket. Inside, Helena's hands were folded peacefully, scarred, slightly crooked, but the hands that had taught 400 students, the hands that had played 10,000 songs, the hands that had been saved by mercy. Sophie placed something on the casket, Morrison's gloves. The daughter had given them to her with instructions to bury them with Helena. They had completed their journey, from an unnamed sister who died of cold, through William Morrison, who could not save her, to Helena Fisher, who was saved instead, to 400 students, to 5 grandchildren, to 136 descendants of the Forbach women, 1 pair of gloves, 1 act of mercy, 1 choice to help instead of ignore. And from that choice, a tree of life had grown, branches spreading across decades and continents and generations, roots deep in the cold earth of Forbach, flowers blooming in Philadelphia and Hamburg, in Bavaria, in Detroit, in Washington, D.C. The last person to leave the funeral was Sophie, 80 years old, still carrying her mother's rosary beads. She paused at the casket, placed 1 hand on the wood. We made it, Helena. All 15 of us made it to the end of the war. And 47 children came after us, and 89 grandchildren, and more great-grandchildren than anyone can count. All because we asked for help, and all because they said yes. She smiled through tears. You were right. Mercy echoes forever. Outside, the Philadelphia sun was setting. Inside Helena's piano studio, 3 students were practicing. Young fingers on keys, making mistakes, learning, trying again, creating music from silence. On the wall hung a photograph. 15 women in German uniforms standing in front of a textile warehouse. Forbach, France, December 1944. Beneath it, a small brass plaque. In memory of Helena Fischer-Strauss, pianist, teacher, survivor. She taught us that mercy transcends borders, compassion crosses conflicts, and small acts echo through generations. Her hands remembered. So will we. The music continued. Simple melodies becoming complex pieces, mistakes becoming mastery, students becoming teachers. And somewhere in the sound, if you listen carefully, you could hear it. The echo of a choice made in winter 1944. The sound of gloves being offered to frozen hands. The whisper of mercy in a world at war. It echoed still, through time, through space, through generations yet unborn. Because some choices matter more than we know. Some mercies echo forever, and some hands once saved create beauty that never ends. The lesson was simple. The impact was infinite. Ask for help when you need it. Give help when you can. See the humanity in your enemies. Choose mercy over indifference. Follow the rules that protect the weak. Do small acts with great love. Morrison and Brennan had done this. Helena had received it. 400 students had learned it. 136 descendants had inherited it. And now you know it too. The story of the hands that stopped moving. The story of the Americans who chose mercy. The story of mercy echoing through 70 years and still ringing clear. Winter 1944 was cold, but warmth survived. Hatred was strong, but compassion was stronger. Death was everywhere, but life prevailed because 2 soldiers gave gloves and fought for heat and followed regulations that said even enemies deserve dignity. Because 15 women chose to ask for help instead of dying with pride. Because mercy once given multiplies forever. The hands remember, the music continues, the echo never ends. That is the lesson, that is the legacy, that is the warmth protocol. Mercy given, mercy received, mercy remembered. Mercy echoed through time eternal. And that perhaps is the only thing that really matters.